Okay. Just make sure. Yeah, okay. Okay. Now, moving around a little bit, going back to Latin America. In the latter 1800s, Latin America began to prosper a little bit. Most of the food that Europeans ate came from Latin America. Why not from Europe? Because Europeans' farmland was largely taken up. So Latin America provided the food that was eaten by most of Europeans. But when it came to manufactured goods, Latin America could not compete at that time. So they depended on the outside world for manufactured goods, things like automobiles or radios or whatever. Something else, a lot of Latin America is tropical, and it is known that, I mean, if you're from a tropical climate, hopefully you won't take offense, but a lot of times tropical peoples are not as industrious as peoples from temperate climates. And people try to analyze what's the reason for this, and one reason might be that in a tropical climate you can plant whenever you want to and harvest whenever you want to. In a temperate climate, you've just got a few days in which you can plant, and if you don't plant then, you're not going to. And then you have to harvest whenever you can. Now, back to the subject of corn. In 2019, the expected price of corn to go up drastically this year because the corn farmers never found an opportunity to plow in places like Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. Why not? Because there was so much rain that the ground was nothing but a mud puddle, and you cannot plow in a mud puddle. Even tractors get stuck. And to make a long story short, the corn farmers could not plow their gardens, and it's now too late. If they start planting now, the frost will get the corn before it ripens, so it's too late. I mean, you might say, don't we have a frost in October here in Georgia, but up there they have their first frost in September, pretty early in September. So, but anyway, you have a certain window of opportunity. We have to plow, a certain window of opportunity where you plant, and a small window of opportunity when you harvest. In a tropical climate, just whenever I feel like it. And typically, much too often, tropical peoples, if they get a job, they'll set a fish trap, and on their way to work, they'll check the trap if there's a fish in it. I don't have to go to work today, I've got a fish. Go home and feed their family the fish in the trap. And you might say, well, hey, they should set a fish trap, but then if they catch a fish, they should check the trap on their way home from work. And if they have a fish, fine, they can feed their family, and then the money they earned today, put it in savings for a rainy day. No, these tropical peoples don't see things that way. I mean, that's an oversimplification, and don't say that all people are that way, but a lot of them are. But anyway, Latin America is larger, a lot of it is tropical or subtropical, and they did not industrialize as much. Now, also, I'm talking now about 2019, you look at a typical Latin American automobile, and it's actually a 1950s car that they have kept up down through the years. They can get away with that because without snow falling, and in Cuba it's the same way, without snow falling, they don't have any salt on the road, so the cars don't rust. And they will keep a 57 Chevy or a 59 Buick running for 50 years or more. Or they sometimes have to replace the engines, but they'll keep their cars running just by replacing the parts, and almost every Latin American is an expert mechanic. And they don't want to buy the modern cars because you can't work on today's cars. Without specialized tooling, you can't fix them. I mean, if they break, I quit working on my cars a long time ago. After I lost one up a time or two, I quit working on them. I mean, anyway, I do replace the battery and I replace tires, but anymore I don't even hardly replace tires. Now, Latin America tended to have dictators. They would try democracy, and democracy would not work. They tried democracy again and again. Democracy would not work. Now, eventually, due to pressure from the United States, they have gotten at least some democracy to work here in recent times. Now, the United States would oftentimes send troops into Latin America. They've done this during my time. Ronald Reagan sent troops to Grenada, and Lyndon Johnson sent troops to the Dominican Republic. I got permission from my two sisters to tell this story, so I'll not tell it. When I was 18 years old, these two sisters got into a fight, ages 8 and 10. The 10-year-old was beating up pretty badly on the 8-year-old, and I didn't think it was fair, so I thought I'd intervene on behalf of the 8-year-old, and the next thing I knew, both of the girls were pounding on me.
Oh, wow.
I mean, first the older one started, and then the younger one who was trying to help joined in. Now, what does this have to do with Latin America, or United States intervention in Latin America? The answer is everything. Everything you can do is wrong. You make both sides mad at you. This also applies a lot to our United States involvement in the Arab world, even the United States involvement in Vietnam. Wind up getting both sides against you. All right. Anyway, the dictator, the church, foreign capitalists, all had an alliance to help make the poor poorer. Again, and who were the foreign capitalists? Mostly people from the United States. So the dictator, a church, and American capitalists did a lot. They had revolution after revolution, and typically a family would go to sleep at night with one government and wake up the next morning and find out that during the night a coup had taken place and a new government had taken over. This was so typical, and the story went on. It went on in Mexico. In Mexico, they had a revolution. The revolution did give some relief to the poor. The United States investors did a lot to dominate Latin American economy. Now, the United States also fought a war in the 1890s that did a lot to get us more involved. The name of that war was the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was fought largely over Cuba and the Philippines, that Spain was running both Cuba and the Philippines and treating the Cubans and Filipinos with utmost cruelty. So the United States moved in its army and whipped Spain pretty quickly and drove Spain out of both Cuba and the Philippines. And as a result of the war, we got Puerto Rico, which we still have, and we got Samoa, which we still have, American Samoa. The Philippines we gave up. Now, I just said about a minute ago that the Spanish were treating the Filipinos with cruelty. When the United States took over, the Filipinos rebelled against us, and we moved in the army and treated them with more cruelty than the Spanish did. This was something my teachers did not tell me. This was something my history books didn't tell me. This is something I have learned lately. In 1946, so we did give the Filipinos their independence. The Filipinos tried democracy. It didn't work. They tried dictatorship, and that is somewhat functional. Today's Filipino dictator is, by our standards, cruel. By their standards, it seems like it's what they need. All right. Puerto Rico, again, we still have Puerto Rico. One of my brothers taught school in Jamaica for a while, and I'd visit Jamaica, and he would tell me that, oh, Puerto Rico is a rich country, rich land. Unlike Jamaica, today Puerto Rico is exceptionally poor. And they're part of the United States. A hurricane ripped through Puerto Rico a couple years ago, and the Puerto Ricans have still not recovered from it. And a lot of Puerto Ricans have fled to the United States. Any of you know any about this from outside? By any chance? A few of you have heard about it. Yes. So what happened to all their association with the United States? To make a long story short, they became socialistic, and it led to impoverishment. That's my take on it. Now, if any of you know any more, of course, they weren't helped by the big hurricanes that come through. That area of the world gets the worst of the hurricanes. And Puerto Rico is often in the path of a hurricane. All right. Now, the United States. Your book opens up with the fact that, and this is true, blacks in the South were denied the right to vote. You might say, I thought the 15th Amendment, all right, here's a story. The 13th Amendment in the United States freed the slaves, the 14th made them citizens, and then the 15th gave the right to vote. The 15th spells out, regardless of previous condition of servitude, in other words, even former slaves could vote. But then the southern states set up a literacy test. And the Supreme Court overturned the 15th Amendment. Believe me, they can overturn anything. And they said the literacy test was legal. What did it take to pass one of those literacy tests? How many of you know? What did it take? You had to have a pass the literacy test. You had to have a white skin. The folk that, I mean, this is in any history book. A black man with a PhD failed it one time, while an illiterate white man passed it. The illiterate white man had to have help in reading the names of the candidates, but he was allowed to vote. Blacks were kept from voting because, again, much too often a black person was given the literacy test in Chinese, and they showed a black man the test one time in Chinese, and they say, "Can you read it?" "Yeah, I can read it." "Well, what does it say?" He said, "It says there won't be very many Africans voting on election day." That's not what it actually said, but and I don't mean to be opening up old racial wounds, but I don't want to sweep it under the rug either. What I'm talking about actually did happen, and some of you might have heard it from other sources. But as recently as 1968, that was the year I became a sophomore in college, blacks were still being denied the right to vote in a lot of states. But then the civil rights movement took over. The civil rights bill was passed and signed by the president at that time, Lyndon Johnson by name. And then also northern people moved to the South, persons like myself, and they turned southern politics around. And southern politicians, men like Strom Thurmond and George Wallace by name, had to start courting the black vote and had to make overtures to black people because they realized time was against them. There were a lot of labor unrest in the United States, even though the United States had become the world's richest nation by 1900. And now, the most of the wealth was controlled by a small minority. Now, folk, your book is going to make this sound like a bad thing. I think that's essential for anybody to grow, any country to grow. You have to let your rich forge ahead and get richer. Otherwise, there's no growth. Eventually, I mean, at one time, senators were chosen by state legislatures. But an amendment to the Constitution said that senators were chosen by popular vote. At one time, presidential candidates were chosen in what they called smoke-filled rooms. The delegates would get together and pick the candidates. Today, the candidates are picked by direct primary. So that became more democratic. You win the nomination from your party by winning the most primaries. And every president since George Washington has gotten to be president through a political party. No exceptions. Whether his name be Kennedy or whether his name be Trump, you have to get the nomination of your party. The United States got the Hawaiian Islands, again by means that we might today call crooked. The Hawaiian Islands were very important owing to the fact that Hawaii is right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So it was a refueling place, for one thing. In other words, if a ship crossed the Pacific, would stop in Hawaii and fuel up and get more food and water for its crew and then continue the rest of the trip across the ocean. Otherwise, if they had to carry all that food and water and fuel, it would have weighted the ship down. So the Hawaiian Islands, very important for the United States to have, and we took it from the people who had it and annexed Hawaii, and eventually Hawaii became state number 50. Another reform, I mean, I mentioned how that tariffs were the way that governments used to get money. Then the governments began to tax income, a direct income tax. And this was to lead to the government taking its tax money from you before you get it. And all of you who've ever gotten a paycheck can look at your paycheck stub, which today, I mean, for instance, in my case, my paycheck stub that I get from this school is online, so they don't have to give me a paycheck. I can find out online, know how much they're withholding and why they're withholding it. But the government now they save your money for you. It's called Social Security. And they take out your income tax and hold it. And then before April 15th of every year, you file a tax return. If you don't know what I'm talking about, believe me, you eventually will. I know you probably have a good idea what I'm talking about. Yeah. Anyway, you have any comments?
I do have a comment about that.
Yeah.
All right. I've heard people have conversation about this. I've listened to conversations with
Yes.
individuals about this whole Social Security piece, that it's our money that we're paying into this, right? So
Yeah.
what happens is, it's a big controversy about the Social Security, because if it's my money that I'm paying into, okay, it's my money, okay, right? Why is it when it's time to get Social Security, it's alleged that further down the road, they're saying, different people are saying, by the time certain people get to a certain age,
You
we
get
won't
there.
we won't have Social Security. But how is that when I'm paying my money into it?
I do have the answer to that. The money that I'm paying into Social Security now, and that you're paying into, is being used not to save up for you, it's being used to support older people. In other words, I'm collecting Social Security right now. But I'm collecting not the money that I saved, but the money that I saved was used to pay the older folk who would have it before me. And then, I mean, practically every college student has heard this. So I hope I'm not telling any of you anything new. And then the money that the money that you are paying into it now is not being saved for you, it's being used to pay me. Now, how many of you have actually honestly heard this? Okay, I believe about every hand went up. Every hand went up, yeah. No, it's okay. And also, another bad thing with Social Security, you cannot pass it on to your heirs if you die. And also, if you die before you collect it, you'll never collect a penny off it. All right, go ahead. That's the weakness. And oh yeah, and something else that you brought up. It's believed that the Social Security system will be bankrupt before any of you younger folk will be able to collect it. And some of you might have heard that from other sources. Yes?
I think this kind of thing do happen in China.
Did that happen in China?
Yeah, do happen in China. Like a lot of states in China, there are too many older people. They need money, right? And actually they cannot work, but not enough labor are working. Like young people, they are not enough. So, you know.
Here's
They always.
here's what I understand happened in China. It's happened in the United States too. We have aborted 60 million babies since 1973. 60 million, and that's one reason. And also between birth control and couples, a lot of people not even marrying at all, and a lot of people having no children. There's not enough babies, not enough young people to support the older people. In China, they practiced birth control for a while, lots of it, but now they've stopped the practice. But they did a lot of the same thing until there were not enough young people. And in Japan, it's the same story. Folk, no matter who you are, when you get old, it's the young people who have to support you. Again, where's my Social Security money coming from? You younger folk who are working. What about the money I saved? It's already spent. This is well known now. This is not conspiracy theory.
Right.
I mean, this is something, yeah, you've heard, and I believe everyone in this class has heard that. So, and also, I mean, some people say that college students don't know a lot, but every college class I teach, almost everyone in all the classes have heard this. It's not new. So, in other words, they've all heard what I just said.
So that's why some people say you better not just completely depend on Social Security.
Believe me,
That,
why am
when
I
I'm gonna
here,
get this Social
and I
Security.
just turned 70 years old, why am I here? And I spent 27 years at Lockheed. And I still draw a pension in Lockheed.
Right.
But of course, I mean, I got married late, and my children, 2 of my 3 children are still living at home. And right, that's kind of personal, but they're taking a lot of the money that my one daughter has a big college debt, and my other son keeps quitting his jobs, and maybe for the best of reasons. And in one case, he quit because, I mean, he couldn't do it. He couldn't do the job that he was called, and that has happened to me, and it probably happened to all of you at one point or another. Just because you can do something right in one area does not mean you can do anything. And he took on a job that he simply could not do, and he was going to get fired if he didn't quit. He quit. But he spent a lot of time unemployed. So that's that. So and also I know a friend of my wife's who never married, a lady friend who never married, taught school for about 40 years, retired, and now is working at 2 part-time jobs. That is, I mean, that's what lies ahead for you folks. Now I want to say this about retirement. My daddy retired in 11 days after he retired, he dropped through a heart attack. So why don't I quit? Well, I would just name a couple of reasons. But anyway, most of you might never experience where you can just simply quit work and not have any income unless you become wealthy. All right. Let's see.
You're talking about the income tax?
Yeah, the income tax. Oh, yes. Now, Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, I'm not going to write their name down, but they extended the power of the federal government more and more. A Federal Reserve was set up. Federal income taxes were imposed. The United States became more and more involved in world affairs. And we acquired the Hawaiian Islands, as well as Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines, even though we did not keep Cuba. Now, later on, the Russians were to condemn us soundly as imperialist. Here's what happened. The nations of Europe started grabbing up colonies, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, and then we did it. But then when we did it, all of a sudden it became popular in the nation. You're rotten imperialists. Well, hey, we're doing what you've been doing all along. Oh, but we know it's wrong. But we're going to turn these colonies of ours loose. But we got criticized severely. And when I was a child, the Soviet Union used to refer to Americans as imperialists, not just as capitalists, but imperialists in a negative way. Again, that's the subject of another chapter, though. All right. Canada, the only thing I remember about Canada is they took in a lot of European immigrants and they tended to want to send them westward. There was most Canadian people live in the region around Ottawa and Quebec, but more and more they tried to send them westward like we did, trying to get people to move west. Canada began to do the same thing. Now, Central Europe, I'm back to Europe now. Parliamentary governments, Eastern Europe, but I'm talking mostly about Russia, Eastern Europe, autocratic and resisting change. And this was to be true of Russia until the Great Revolution of 1917. All right, now back to Great Britain. 2 parties, the Liberal and the Conservative. And this has been true of Great Britain's politics now for about 180 years. The pendulum would swing back and forth, left, and left, right, left, right, left, right. Now, in my own lifetime, the Liberals were in charge when I was a kid, but then Margaret Thatcher began to move them back to the right. Margaret Thatcher was conservative. I recall they had an election one time when I was in high school in Britain, and they said that the Conservatives just don't have a chance. But after many more years of liberalism, the Conservatives were able to take over. But But this was true in the 1800s. They had the liberals and conservatives. The members of the House of Commons eventually got to be paid. Now this is important because only the wealthier people could serve in the House of Commons, people who had a business established or had some money on the side. But then they started paying the members of the House of Commons, and this enabled some poor people to get involved. So people other than wealthy could sit in the House of Commons. Great Britain began to pass more social legislation that was to lead to the welfare state, and folk, the welfare state has done a lot to keep Great Britain from becoming what Great Britain might otherwise be. France, after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, France finally got its democracy. But they wound up not like us, where we have a two-party system and only have basically two parties. In France, everybody it seemed formed a party, and they had dozens of political parties. And the only way, and this is true today, the only way that France's government can operate is if they can get as many parties as they can into a coalition of parties. So this party will join with that party. There's the Christian Democrats, there's the Conservative, the Labour Party, and whatever else. I don't know how many others, but when a prime minister or president of France is elected, he sees how many parties can I get under my wing. And the more parties he gets on his side, the more powerful he is, the more influential he is. In France, governments changed often. They did not have four-year elections. It's just when the people decided they wanted an election, they would have a vote of no confidence. That vote of no confidence means we have a new election. And the governments changed often. Italy had a lot of labor disputes. The northern part of Italy was factories, industrialized. The south was rural and poor. Government officials were corrupt. Governments changed often. All right. Then something else happened. Sounds kind of strange. Italy went into Ethiopia to conquer Ethiopia. And in those days, keep in mind, all European countries were conquering these African and Far Eastern nations. So it's time we went in and we get to Ethiopia. And Ethiopia clobbered your army. And Italy went home terribly embarrassed. Now, how did Ethiopia win? Well, for one thing, Great Britain decided we're not going to stand by it. But Great Britain did not send any troops to Ethiopia. Instead, Great Britain supplied the Ethiopian people with rifles, really, really good rifles, better than the ones the Italians were using. And the Ethiopians were able to use these rifles to clobber the Italian army. Also, the climate. The Italians went into that climate and all of them got sick. All kinds of diseases that people who go into a tropical climate, including especially malaria. This was before they knew about antibiotics, so malaria took its toll. Anyway, Italy went home in disgrace. Now don't forget this, folks, because we're going to find out that Italy later came back. This time Italy had tanks and airplanes that Ethiopia didn't have. And Italy did finally conquer Ethiopia. Then when Italy was on the losing side in World War II, Italy was forced to give it back. But in the 1880s, 1890s, Italy could not conquer Ethiopia. So Italy then conquered Libya. And Italy and Libya still keep somewhat of a close relationship. But Italy conquered Libya, which they could handle better than Ethiopia. Again, Libya was a Muslim country. Its people were primitive and lagged behind. The next chapter will talk more about this stuff, so but keep it in mind. In Germany, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and the Kaiser were the power. The Kaiser was Wilhelm II. The Prime Minister was Bismarck, whom I mentioned earlier. But eventually, Wilhelm II deposed Bismarck. But now Kaiser Wilhelm was the one who got his people involved in World War I. And he wound up finding himself being a whole man in a small farm in Holland. Germany had a very large army, and a lot of German people said, we want to find our place in the sun. German arrogance had its beginnings about this time, where the German people felt that we're better than anyone else. Now, I've talked